History is littered with examples of smaller, weaker forces coming up against larger, stronger forces, and yet somehow winning. Whether it's Hannibal defeating a Roman army twice its size by positioning his troops in an interesting way, or Napoleon taking out the Russian and Austrian armies by using deception, or maybe it's Google taking out Yahoo by focusing its efforts on search instead of being the homepage of the internet. Or even in sports, where the Oakland A's decided to not buy talent, but focus its metrics to find undervalued talent. In the end, what lets a smaller force defeat a stronger, bigger force is strategy. What's up with the history lesson? Well, as talent acquisition and human resource leaders, you're more likely to be the David than the Goliath in these kinds of situations, right? You come up against these better known, better resource companies, and yet somehow you have to win the talent fight against them. No matter how the world of hiring and recruiting changes, it's strategy that's going to be the key to your success. So if you want to gain an edge against companies that are better resourced, have more recruiters, have better brand awareness, you need to get serious about strategy. Joining me in this podcast is Marcus Body of 33, and he is as obsessed with strategy and talent strategy as I am. And together, we're going to help you discover untapped opportunities and new ways of looking at your hiring challenges. We're going to be going deep into this subject because we know that when you build a strong talent strategy, you can compete for talent and win against anyone.
You're listening to The Brand Plan, the podcast about the intersection of talent, brand, and strategy, with your hosts, Marcus Body of 33 and James Ellis of Employer Brand Labs.
Sitting beside me is Marcus Body of 33. He has been in agencies building employer brands that you have heard of every single day, possibly of your entire life. It's very possible. He's a young man, but don't let him fool you. He's got that kind of skill. Marcus?
And this is James Ellis. I'm sure many of you know him already, but he is the brains behind the Employer Brand Labs, writes fantastic books. There's one just published called Employer Branding for Small Business. I'm sure many of you have a copy. We've both been doing this for far too long, so hopefully this is going to be an interesting podcast for you to listen to.
I'm super pumped. I say that a lot of podcasts. I use the word pumped. I don't know why. Legitimately pumped, no question. And I want to start this conversation very simply. We hear about talent strategy, this magical term, talent strategy. We sprinkle it on like pixie dust, like it's going to make things magically better. Except in my experience, most people who say talent strategy have no clue what talent strategy is. Am I the only one? Am I the weirdo in this case? Okay, don't answer that question exactly that way, but is that a common situation? Are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I think so. I think people want to be strategic, but they aren't necessarily 100% sure what they mean by being strategic. And you see, things that are basically a plan have the word plan crossed out, strategy scribbled in at the drafting stage, because it kind of sounds better and it sounds like somebody ought to give me more money if I call it a strategy rather than a plan.
Yeah, it's an adjective to meaning smarter plan.
Yeah, exactly. It's like using the word utilize instead of use. It sort of makes everything seem more important. But
exactly.
I mean, I think it's a shame though, because actually there is something into trying to work out having a strategy, and you can achieve a whole different scale of kind of impact if you do have a strategy. But a lot of people kind of just use the word without ever really thinking about what that really means, as opposed to just having a to-do list.
Exactly. Or a tech stack or a series of things that they have to achieve. Yeah, totally. Let's dive into this way. I mean, because I think for me, and I've been I've been a strategy nerd for a very long time. And I've had bosses who literally couldn't tell you the difference between a tactic and a strategy. And I'm not naming names. And if you think it's you, it's not. And for any of my bosses who are listening or former bosses. So let's define strategy. It's one of those words like innovation and culture, which people just seem to use willy-nilly as if they know. But when you say strategy, what do you mean?
So for me, I've heard a couple of people whose definitions I like. I've always liked there's a guy called Michael Porter at Harvard Business School who has this definition of strategy is deciding what you're not going to do. I always think that's a pretty good one-liner if someone's trying to work out is what I'm looking at a plan or a strategy. It's like, and I've asked clients that question before, is there anything we're not going to do that we would have done before we started this process? If there isn't, then we're probably not really in the realm of doing a strategy. We're just putting together a plan, and a perfectly good plan that will do what we need it to do. Yeah. But we don't really have a strategy until we started making some pretty hard decisions about things we're not going to do that we could have done. So I think that was really. How about you? What's the best definition you've heard?
Well, first off, I like that you just slid in Michael Porter, like, like your besties, right? Like he's not like the all revered Harvard Business School doctorate of all things business strategy. Like he had like the two books that are like this thick about business strategy and competitive strategy aren't de rigueur in both political science and business. Okay, so let's just drop that. I really, and as a poli-sci graduate, I remember reading competitive strategy. My thinking about strategy is it's a position. It's more positioning than anything else. It's this idea of how are you going to use whatever resources are at your disposal to maximize their impact either now or down the road, right? And I think of like Napoleon and warfare strategy, where you have this idea of when a big army meets a smaller army. For most of human existence, the big army won every single time. And it wasn't until someone smart said, what if I position my troops in a different way to trick the other side, to charge in the direction I want them, and I envelop them and I destroy them with a half-sized army, which is impossible at the time. That is strategy, to say doing more with less, making a bigger impact with less, and putting yourself in a position every step of the way where you are more likely to win the next time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other place where you get a lot of good strategy analogies is in sports. And, it depends where you are in the world, which sport you're talking about. But, it is that belief in, okay, we're going to win this game by having a really tall person up front and some short people behind them. Or, we're going to win this game by getting the fastest people we can hire. Or we're going to, and it's something to do with a belief in how you're going to win. That you can then use to kind of decide what you're going to do next. And so there's lots of, unfortunately, the thing about sport is that it's not a great analogy for business, because obviously, it's not 11 people against 11 or 6 against 6 like it is in sport. Very often you can be a tiny business up against giant businesses or vice versa. And that can shape the strategy that you should take. It's knowing how big you are versus who you're up against. It starts to become pretty important.
Yeah. So how do you know? So you're talking to a client, you're talking to anybody, and they say, I got this strategy. What's your litmus test? What's your acid test to say, actually, friendo, this is not a strategy. This is just a really well-designed PowerPoint deck. And kudos for you on a very attractive deck, but it's not a strategy.
Absolutely. Well, so I find a good test is one I nicked actually from politics. There's a thing I don't know whether this phrase gets used in America, but in the UK we quite often talk about the manifesto test. Is this politician saying anything that anybody would reasonably ever say the opposite of?
Exactly.
So, we believe in children is not really, it doesn't pass that test, because no one's ever said children are terrible. We couldn't care less about them. Whereas if someone says, I'm going to spend more money on this, and the opposing party aren't saying we're going to spend more money on that, okay, now we've got something that passes the manifesto test. It's kind of the same with the strategy test. Is if someone said, if we look at someone's strategy and go, yeah, but are any of your competitors doing anything different, or is this going to be on all of their list of things to do? Then you probably don't really have a strategy. You might have a perfectly sensible plan, but it's not a strategy.
Yeah, if you say, we're going to hire the best people ever, that's not a strategy. That's a goal. That's a hope. Yeah. How are you going to make that happen? And given that you are not a massive company, or you are not famous, or you're not have the world-beating product, or whatever your particular set of constraints are, how are you achieving that goal? That's the strategy. It's like, look, you think of a very young Google. At the time, Yahoo decimated everybody. They owned the space. I don't care what you say about Ask Jeeves. I don't care what you say about Hotbot. Everybody remember Hotbot? And we're old enough to remember Hotbot.
Just about.
But Google was just a couple of guys with a good idea. One of them was, I think it was a PhD thesis idea about how to order strategy and how to leverage social cues to rank stuff. They were a handful of people that turned. So how does a handful of people dominate Yahoo? Well, people don't remember this.
Yeah.
But way back when, the turn of the century, yes, I said turn of the century, meaning internet century, they actually sold their search engine or licensed their search engine to Yahoo. Yahoo was all about, look, we don't care about search. We care about a directory. We care about making a homepage that looks...
pages, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And making it, and selling a crap ton of ads and doing all like the homepage of the internet, right? And they just went search. Yeah, that's something the nerds do. And they licensed Google's technology, and that's how Google. So there's a time in which Google had to have said, if we want to beat them, how do we win? Well, for an interim stage, I guess we kind of have to join them, leverage their audience, and then we can splinter off. That is a strategy.
Same thing happened with Microsoft and IBM though, with the early stages of development of Windows. It was this is the way you're going to do it. If you're two guys in a garage in Seattle, is you have to sort of find yourself a bigger partner to play with, and that then becomes a strategy. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I guess the challenge when it gets to sort of talent strategy is that if you're going to do it, the first thing you need to be able to work out is, what is it that we're actually supposed to be achieving? Do you have a very good definition of what your part of the business is supposed to be doing for the business as a whole? And if you don't really have a very good definition of what you're trying to achieve, then you can't really begin on a strategy. That's always got to be your first point. And very often the reality is people don't have a great idea beyond hire the best people we can, be a magnet for talent, employer of choice, these kind of all things which are all good in their own right, but they don't give you anything more specific to aim at. And but what we actually want you to do is this. That's what you can start getting into strategy.
The first question I would have is, when you say best people, what the heck does best people mean? Are you talking about Nobel laureates? Are you talking about people who are already the best in their field? Or are you hiring the people who you suspect are likely to be those people 5-10 years down the road? Or are you hiring young and you're hiring the people who are valedictorians of cool school number 1, 2, or 3? What do you define as best?
Completely. And I think there are, there are some very old-fashioned views still out there that, some people are better than others and you can rank humanity from top to bottom. And it just doesn't work that way. You can have someone who's brilliant in one context and is awful in another. I remember a while ago, a client I was working with said to me, we've been hiring all these people with PhDs and they're not very good at multitasking. And I said, well, no, they've spent 3 years answering one question. That's not the same. You're hiring a PhD. You're hiring someone who has extreme focus, not someone who's great at multitasking. Then the solution is simple: stop hiring the people coming straight out of a PhD. Hire someone who's done something else after their PhD, and they might well be able to do that. And there's a lot right now. I'm reading a lot about creativity. This idea that, look, you're not better and more creative because you've gone a step farther. It's sometimes because you've taken this wild left turn seemingly for no reason, or you're introducing ideas from some out left field kind of area, and suddenly 2 + 2 = 47. And that's, and you're right, PhDs look through the world through a drinking straw. They see one thing at a time for years on end, whereas, very often the person who's new to the field will ask the stupid question like, why do we do it that way? Which suddenly flips over the entire conversation. I mean, you look at, I work at an ad agency. We hire a lot of people for creativity. What we want when we're hiring people into 33 is people who've got ideas and can think differently. But, the people I know who happen to be good at that have come from just the most ridiculously different backgrounds. And the things people have done before they've ended up in employer brand agencies, I can think of at least 2 really good colleagues I've got who were both mental health nurses. I don't know how you make that transition from working in adult mental health to working in employer branding, but they're both very good at it in completely different parts of our business. Or
it might be a completely natural transition that we choose to not consider, which that may be a whole separate podcast. That's a whole separate thing.
But it's kind of fascinating, isn't it, though? Because when you're hiring for creativity, suddenly all these sorts of standard metrics kind of go out the window, because it's no longer about who's got the most impressive CV or who got the best grades when they were at school, or all of that sort of stuff becomes a bit irrelevant when you're hiring for someone who can think creatively and on the spot come up with a new idea.
This year, one agency won more RAD awards for recruitment marketing, branding, and communications than any other, with work that has transformed the employer brand of some of the world's biggest companies. That agency might be a name you don't recognize yet. Stay tuned to learn more.
They might not have very good things for any of those kind of old-fashioned criteria. And it's why more employers are abandoning kind of the traditional kind of qualifications and criteria and starting to look at, is there something else we can test to figure out how good these people are going to be?
Yeah, and you use the word test with a little t test, not like with a big like some sort of, and I think the other part of it is, and I'm a big Tom Peters fan. Anybody who knows me know I've read everything the man has written. I worship the altar of Tom. Congratulations on retiring, Tom. You're never going to hear this, but thanks. His idea that in the 80s was that you hire the best of the best, and you spend so much money to hire these amazing people, and then you ask them to check their brains at the door. That's a very 80s idea, but at the same time, I don't know we're that far down the path away from it. I know a lot of companies who simply say, we want the best, and then we're going to tell you what to do. To which I wonder, what did you think you were hiring?
Completely. Well, I mean, I've had certainly worked with clients before in professional services, and they'll say to me, we want people with an entrepreneurial mindset. And I'll go, but people with an entrepreneurial mindset are setting up their own businesses.
Yeah.
By definition, they're not going to be applying to a graduate scheme. It's not the kind of thing you do if you are super, unless you're promising to pay them an enormous amount of money so that they can leave you after 2 years and go and set up their own business. That, you can set up a promise for entrepreneurial people, but it has to be short term, and it has to involve the amount of money they need to go and set up their own business. And there are some businesses starting to experiment with that now, saying, do we hire someone and say, you work for us 3 days a week, and 2 days a week you do your own thing, and maybe you get some capital from us to help you do that. Okay, now you can hire entrepreneurial people because you're making an offer that will appeal to them. But it's back to that strategy point. If you haven't worked out what you're trying to achieve with talent, then you don't know which of these things is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Once you've been through the strategy loop, you can now have a much better idea about, which one of these many, many, many possibilities should we start sort of playing towards.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There are a million ways to achieve any particular talent strategy goal. I've made a bit of a career saying, look, you only need sidewalk chalk to establish your employer brand. You just go to where the conference is, where everybody you want to hire is, and you write something really interesting on the sidewalk in front of that conference. You are guaranteed to establish a brand and get interest.
Sure.
At the same time, you can spend $14 million doing, all sorts of different things. There's a million ways to do it. So strategy says, look, okay, yes, you have to have a goal. You have to know what you're trying to achieve. I think you teased in this idea of you have to understand what that, if you're talking about a particular audience, what are their motivations? What do they care about? If they're entrepreneurial, you give them this. How do you reward them appropriately? How do you communicate to them so that they understand what you're offering to them? And then how do you measure it all?
Yeah. Completely. And it's such a, I think very often what overwhelms people is when they sit down to start doing strategy, that feels like an overwhelming list of things that you have to understand everything of. And I suppose I always try and reassure them, like, you only actually need to understand these things one at a time. I would always start by trying to understand, right, what is the objective that the business is trying to achieve? And it might be there are multiple objectives. It might be we're trying to achieve with this kind of person, and that with that kind of person, and the other with that kind of person. So, we sometimes talk to clients about, sometimes the game that you're playing is being really easy to apply to for someone who just needs a job right now. And for a lot of employers, that might be their entire plan to be that.
Yes.
For a really big employer, that might just be for some types of employees you want to be that. Whereas for, a more specialist role of someone who's going to be in your industry and he's going to be in your industry for 40 years, it's like, okay, you can now build a reputation with these people. You're going to have a relationship with them, either as competitor or employer, for 40 years. Okay, you can start building associations with that. You are interesting enough to them that you can now have a brand strategy with those people rather than simply that kind of tactical, just looking good at the moment when they're looking kind of strategy. But small businesses might do the overwhelming amount of their activity on that kind of quick return, having a great shop window thing. That's probably good enough if you're a small employer. Yeah,
if you're hiring 20 people versus hiring 20,000 people, the scale dictates the strategy a lot of times. Exactly.
And if you kind of copy someone else's really successful strategy, but there's something crucially different about you, you can have a horrible time. Because, if you're like a little tech startup and you try copying IBM, you're going to lose. They've got more money than you. They've got, they've got more visibility than you. They've got more brand awareness. The brilliant, perfect approach for them is going to be wrong for you, and vice versa. You have, I've done some really successful employer brand things before with organisations that I've never tried to replicate with anyone else because they're just too unique and weird and different. Did an employer brand project for CERN, the people who run the Large Hadron Collider. But that's a unique organisation. What works with them is not going to work with anyone else because no one else is changing the laws of physics. It's like it allows you to do a slightly different thing.
Does Elon Musk count in the way he thinks about Twitter? Is that changing the laws of physics? or let's not get political.
He's changing the laws of social media. I think we can accept
something.
That. Yeah.
Of something, certainly. So I'm interested by this idea that you don't have to have it all mapped out. So I'm a big fan of if you're thinking about warfare, Napoleon didn't have the whole campaign mapped out. He was winning battle after battle after battle. And I think about like a Netflix. And remember, Netflix did not start as an internet behemoth. It started by envelopes and trying to beat Blockbuster. And it wasn't until they had success with the envelope situation, and they kind of had this weird off. Hey, let's put 12 movies, and like it was only 12 movies. It was something teeny, some teeny amount of content. We'll make it easy to stream, and of course, nobody had a box or a way to stream. They had 12 customers. It was teeny. It was nothing. It was just this idea that they said, you know what, the envelopes will fund this idea that could one day be a world beater, we don't know. That is an emerging strategy. They didn't start the business that said one day we will be the world's provider, internet provider of digital media, because at the time, internet was for email, right? They started saying, how do we win this? They started to win, and they started to look for what are other opportunities in places where we can win.
So I think what they did have is at any point they had a sense of we're going over there. And at any point you could have said, where are you going now? And they go, we're going over there. Then they were ready to change direction as the possibilities changed. Absolutely. But, you know, they always had a sense of what they were trying to do next. And I think that was what allowed them to win, is kind of having that very fierce sense of what they were currently trying to do at the moment. Even if they knew that might change. There's that wonderful phrase that crops up when people talk about their evolving business strategy. And, you know, actually, if it's evolving, it means that it's mutating randomly in lots of directions and the successful bits survive. Now, that's actually kind of true in an awful lot of business.
It is.
Surprised when people want to admit to it out loud. You know, perhaps they ought to be claiming that it's intelligently designed. But, you know, it's an interesting...
It's a different podcast for sure.
Meet 33. Known for creating and elevating some of the world's most valuable employer brands here in the US and across the pond in Europe, 33 understands that everyone has a story to tell. From KFC to BMW, from AWS to KPMG, 33 has been building some of the most creative and influential employer brands around the world. If you want to see how they can tell your company's story, head to their website in our show notes.
Okay, so we talked about this before, and you dropped a term that I thought was really interesting, and I want to reintroduce to everybody listening, and that's the idea of a solution-neutral problem statement. Can you talk a bit about this idea? Because I was trained as a poli-sci person, which, you know, sorry everybody, and you came from a different background and have a whole lot of different ways of seeing things. So let's start there.
That's right. So I've got an engineering degree, and, you know...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. The dismissive thing often said by proper scientists about engineers is, you know, engineers are people for whom pi is 3 and a bit. And it's kind of true, right? Engineering is about...
That is the nerdiest joke I have ever heard. Yeah, That's amazing. That is amazing.
But there's some truth to it, because it's about, you know, it's the kind of person who could have studied physics or maths, but kind of went, no, but I want to build things. I want to make stuff. And I want to kind of get my hands dirty and kind of not get tied up in the details. But you have to kind of be able to do a bit of the maths as well.
Yeah.
They taught us this really useful thing on my degree about solution neutral problem statements. And basically, the idea is whenever someone asks you to do something, you know, the classic example I always use is if someone asks you to build a road bridge, what you have to do is try and write down what that person really wanted in a way that doesn't include how you're going to do it. So it might be, you know, there are some cars this side of the river that need to be that side of the river. And yes, a bridge is a solution to that, but so's a tunnel, so's a ferry. So is just driving all the way down to the bridge that's already there and driving all the way back. And you need to evaluate all of these things to work out if a bridge is even a good idea in the first place. Then, you know, it might well be, and then you can build the right kind of bridge, absolutely. And sometimes, you know, the client was right all along, they do need a bridge. But, you know, clients who work with me will be very familiar with this, because whenever they say to me, we need an EVP, I always start with going, do you? Why?
Yeah.
What are you going to do with it? Tell me why you think you want an EVP, because it might completely do it. And we might actually at the end of it go, you don't really need an EVP, do you? You need a little attraction campaign over here. But unless I've asked you why you wanted that thing, I could easily spend, you know, $50,000 of your money making you a perfectly good EVP, and then we go, oh, it doesn't really do what we needed to do.
Yeah.
That's a shame. And it's too late then to kind of reverse engineer it. It's much easier if you can have that open conversation early on. So yeah, I mean, I find it incredibly valuable. Whenever you're sitting down to do anything at all, you kind of sit down and go, what's the outcome that I want? Absolutely, without any implication of how I might do it at all. And am I able to write that down? And if the answer is you can't write it down, then I would suggest you can't begin this project, because you don't really know what you're trying to achieve, and you don't really know what number you're trying to move. And until you can write that down, you can't really come up with a sensible plan. You'll just kind of throwing darts wildly at the wall, or whatever analogy you want to use for kind of,
or you're just running through the maze, putting one foot in front of the other, just because you're so terrified of stopping or so terrified of making the wrong move. You're just going, and you don't realize the choices you have made and the backlog of choices that you've previously made that are going to dictate where you're heading next.
Completely. And it's where you can end up with this kind of awkward situation of, like, later on trying to justify a business case for what you did and trying to work out why that was a good idea. And, I think we've all been there at some point in life, but it's not a very comfortable place to be. And it gives you a knot in your stomach. And, the way to avoid that arising is to start right back at the beginning going, what is it that I'm actually trying to achieve? And, if it is just, sometimes in talent, it is just getting some bums on seats. I need this many bums on seats with this minimum level of qualification. If I do that, I'm good. Yeah. Fine. Brilliant. The answer might be an employer brand solution. The answer might not. The answer might be a kind of really tactical recruitment campaign. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It might even be using an agency if it's a really specific kind of skill set. Yeah. It might be, actually, I'll just outsource that to someone who can do that for me quickly. And that might be the right answer. But unless you know what it is you're trying to achieve, you can't really ever decide whether what you've done is the right thing or not.
Yeah, yeah. So that leads to the biggest question of all, which is, why is strategy valuable? We talk about it. Everybody talks about it. It's a term you drop in every which way. Everybody in this industry refers to it at some point. But why? Is it back to, it just makes us sound smart, or is there value in having a strategy? And if so, how do you ascertain it? How do you think about it? Or how do you look at that kind of value?
I think there's two parts to the answer. It has a kind of brand, a good brand in itself, strategy, right? In that it sounds good. It sounds like it ought to be paid more. It sounds like it ought to be in more important meeting rooms than if you're not doing strategy. So I think that part of the brand is very good for it, and that's what quite often attracts people to it. It's why they buy their first strategy book. It's why they read their first strategy blog, is because they're going, I would like to be paid more money and be more senior. Okay, strategy seems like a good line to go down, and they're not wrong. I think there is some truth behind it though as well, which is, once you start coming at things that way, you're kind of elevating what you're really doing from a living, from being someone who does what they're told to someone who can actually work out what they should have been told in the first place. And that's an incredibly useful skill that we all get really bad at when we're at school. So when you're at school, you get really good at doing what you're told. Yeah. And it's how you get great grades all the way through the education system, is doing what you're told. And, even up to quite high level academia, it's still, have you done your bibliography correctly? Have you correctly annotated? Or, it's about...
Yeah. What's the joke about academia? Its goal is to make professors. Not to make smart people.
But it teaches you how to comply with a set of rules and to do what you're told, essentially. Yeah. And then suddenly you find yourself in the world of work. And that's useful in the early bit of your career. But there comes a point when actually someone turns around to you and goes, well, what do you think we should do? Okay, now you're in the realms of strategy. And these are the better paid jobs, and they're the more interesting jobs. And I think, lots of people have a career tipping point, and it depends what profession you're in when that will happen. Some people that happens really young, but, even in professional sport, this is the thing that happens when the player, retires and becomes a coach. Okay, now they're into the realms of telling people what to do, not just doing what they're told anymore. Yeah. And that's very often a real kind of surprise to them. They haven't done that before. But it happens whether you're an accountant or a lawyer or a teacher. You become a head teacher. Okay, suddenly you're telling other people what to do, not doing what you're told. It happens in every single career, and I think strategy is the name we call deciding what should be done. Yeah, rather than doing what you're told.
Yeah, I think of like if I'm a TikTok expert, I know how to maximize the value of TikTok. I don't always necessarily know why TikTok over, say, YouTube, right? What is the goal? Yeah, what is the goal we're trying to achieve? And I think that is like the microist kind of version of strategy versus tactics. Like TikTok, Absolutely. You have to put this tag on it, and we know that these songs are really hot right now. Don't ask me, I'm 50 about TikTok. This is sad. This is going to be the clip we play later. Say, watch, like there's going to be a montage of James being old and sad, and this is the clip we'll add to it.
So at what point do we write the employer brand shanty? Because I understood that was going to be a central
Oh, you are up. You are on point, as the kids would say.
That was like 4 years ago, wasn't it? That was at the start of COVID. That was
Who's to say? But anyway, to say, look, I know how to get the most views of TikTok, but what is the goal we're trying to achieve? Is this the right means by which we do it? Right? You know, there's a point at which you say, yeah, TikTok makes sense because you've got a very deep audience. They skew a little younger. They're actively. You want to insert a brand real quick. It's a great way of doing it. YouTube might be a longer tail. You can tell deeper stories. That content can be used differently. But ultimately, when you're making that choice, it's a strategic choice to say, what are we trying to achieve with this content?
Completely. And like, you know, let's pick on that example then. So what you could be trying to achieve completely different things with TikTok. If you're a brand that no one's heard of or that young people haven't heard of, so let's say you're a business-to-business brand, young people haven't heard of you, you might just be using TikTok to get them to know your name. And it might be as simple as that. It is a win if they see our stuff on TikTok and then they could repeat our brand name. And
so when they go to a job board and they see 20,000 jobs, they go, oh, I heard that was a cool company who did that funny TikTok. Bang.
Exactly. Whereas if you're a really well-known brand, but you're kind of misunderstood. So let's say you're a big brand that perhaps has a negative perception out there in the marketplace, right? Then you might be using TikTok to do something completely different. You might be using it to change a perception of you. In which case, you know, that's going to be a lot more difficult to measure because it now doesn't matter how many people have seen your TikTok. It's how many people actually change their minds as a result of seeing your TikTok.
Yes.
But so we're no longer interested with how many people just saw it. That's kind of relevant, but it's not really our objective. Our objective is, have we changed their minds at all? And you need to find a way of tracking that. And, you know, so is TikTok going to be a part of many successful strategies? Absolutely, because it's got loads of eyeballs on it. But it's going to be doing completely different jobs in those strategies, depending on where you're starting from, where you're trying to get people to. You know, therefore, what job you're expecting that channel to do. And if you're a big employer, you might be using it for multiple different objectives for different audiences.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. You talked about the idea of changing perceptions, changing minds. Is that the core of every strategy, or especially every talent strategy? Like, is there a talent strategy that doesn't involve how do I change people's perceptions of me, either growing it, decreasing it, shifting it, whatever?
I think you could definitely say every employer brand strategy is fundamentally about perception change. So I think you could definitely say that. But I think you could have a talent strategy that didn't do that at all. I could run entirely blind adverts that didn't have our logo in it and just sold the jobs on their merits and attracted people that way. And that wouldn't be changing a perception. It'd be kind of sneakily getting people's curiosity. Done that before for a couple of clients. It's surprisingly effective, even if they've got a positive brand. It's just a kind of interesting, different thing that people haven't seen before. But there, you're not really changing a perception because they don't know who they are perceiving at that point.
Yeah.
But it can be really effective. I think you can certainly say if it's an employer brand strategy, you're trying to change what someone thinks or knows about you. Otherwise, what on earth are you putting into your thing? I suppose you could argue you're reminding them of something they know about you brilliant that they already like. But I'd say, 99% of the time you're right. That's going to be the thing. I don't know. What do you reckon?
I think you're right. I think it's an interesting gray area between employer brand strategy and talent strategy, and I think that's a great segue to what we're going to talk about in our next podcast, which are different big buckets of strategy: talent strategy, brand strategy, employer brand strategy, all that stuff. So I think that's a great place to leave it for now. I want to thank everybody for listening. I want to thank my co-host Marcus for being here, for being so darn smart and having such a great accent. Let's not leave that on the table. Amazing accent that I wish I had. So hopefully, Marcus, this is a lot of fun. I hope you're having a lot of fun with these conversations because I want to have a bunch of these for everybody to hear because that's really what the podcast is going to be all about: deeper thinking about talent strategy.
Completely, and I think it's an opportunity for everyone to get thinking about. There are no beautiful right answers in this, but what there are is things that you learn along the way. And when you've been doing it for as long as James has been doing it or I've been doing it, you've kind of discovered a couple of things almost by accident as you keep doing it. And I think what we wanted to do was just kind of open up that conversation and get more people talking about it and, joining in with this conversation about what is it, a strategy? How do you achieve it? What makes it different from just that plan I inherited from my predecessor?
Right. And I think it's safe to say we will not be discussing ATSs. We will not be discussing tech stacks. We will not be getting to that level of pick this tool because that's not what this is about, because it starts with the strategy. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to The Brand Plan. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we'd appreciate it if you'd spread the word.